Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. This episode of Recorded Content features me and Tristan Pelligrino, my business partner at Motion and co-host of Recorded Content. When your company produces a branded podcast, you have the opportunity to create a lot of original content for your audience, pulling perspectives from customers, internal experts, other industry leaders. But a lot of companies miss out on the chance to distribute information through their employee social profiles organically. And companies miss the opportunity to carry on conversations with real people instead of just updates from their corporate social accounts, where maybe you have a social media manager who responds with a thumbs up or a fire emoji. So that's why it's important to encourage employees to provide their own perspectives on the content created from your company's podcast. When an employee offers up their own unique perspectives on top of insights shared in a podcast episode, you're really going to increase the reach and engagement overall. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's jump into it. So Tristan, when a company has a podcast, they naturally share podcast episodes from their corporate account. But what's the big opportunity here for companies beyond their brand's social profiles?
Yeah, I think this is a great question because it is, in fact, a huge opportunity that I feel companies are not taking advantage of. So if you can figure this out as a brand, you really have the ability to grow your audience and really improve the impact of your podcast overall. And so let's think about this for a second. You get a lot of assets out of a podcast if you do it right, and if you use a lot of the ideas that we talk about a lot on this show. But that typically is just really the first wave. That's the first phase. It's all this content typically from the brand's voice, right? It's information that can be shared on the brand's social profiles. But we all know and we all hear that people buy from people. So why don't you create content that is from the different people in your organization that adds a layer of their own perspectives and their own past experiences to really just enrich the content that you get out of a podcast? And that I believe is really the true opportunity that a lot of companies don't take advantage of right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I know for myself and just for our business, I mean, the true engagement that we get, and not B2C, but, P2P, right? Like person to person, the people that I engage with online. And I run Motion's social accounts, right? Like I tweet from Motion. I post on LinkedIn from Motion, multiple posts per day. We have at least one post go out every single day. And I have very little interaction with people in our community from the corporate account. But I have tons of engagement. I mean, relatively speaking, there are people with lots more engagement than me, but from my LinkedIn account, I know Tristan has the same from his LinkedIn account, from his Twitter account. People engage with us, and we are, subcomponents of the overarching brand, but we get, inquiries in our DMs asking, if we can jump on a call to talk about people using our service and just questions about podcasting in general, where we are able to help people that they probably wouldn't ask of the Motion corporate account. They want to know from us. And, I wish more people did that. I think there's a serious common misconception that marketers are just all on social media talking about marketing. I'd say it's a very, very small fraction, probably like 1%. Don't quote me on that. I don't have any hard data. But Tristan, why do you feel like employees don't share more often?
Yeah, I feel like the biggest reason you don't see employees sharing podcast content or really any content marketing in general is because there just is a lack of a framework. People don't really know how. I mean, if you think about an image that's created or an ebook that's out there, what you'll often see is people just share a link. Hey, we just developed this new ebook, or we just released this new episode, or we just created this new demo video, right? And there's nothing added to that. It's really no different than the company posting the same thing. So we see the company post a link to an asset that's out there, and then we see employees will post the same thing, and you'll find that it's really monotonous to keep doing that. And I feel like people might share a link once or twice if it's a really big asset that people, the team spent a lot of time on, but then it kind of dies off then. And you don't really get that consistent approach, right? Every single week, every day, et cetera. You don't build up that momentum with your employees to where they are comfortable sharing the content that you create with their own networks.
Yeah, a little anecdote here, and bless her heart if she's listening. But I went to the beach recently with my mom, and my mom, she's been on Instagram for a little while, and we went to the beach, and we'd all been cooped up, and COVID hadn't really seen each other in a long time for extended periods of time, and so she's very excited, and so she's taking pictures the whole time. And at one point, she's posting, like 3 or 4 Instagram posts per day. And we say to her, Mom, you're really only supposed to post 1 post on Instagram per day. There's no framework there that she would know that. But, it was
she's excited.
Yeah, she's excited. And so she posted all these posts on Instagram, and I think marketers especially, but just anyone, your LinkedIn profile is this outlet of yourself to the business world, and people don't want to be wrong. So my mom didn't care that I course corrected her on the way to post from Instagram. She's like, I don't know, I was just having fun posting. But I think that there is this innate fear from people who don't have a framework, like you mentioned, to not do it the right way. When I tell people, hey, maybe don't share the company's post, actually post it yourself. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And then it's like, oh, I did it wrong. And do people think and know that I did it wrong? And do I look silly or whatever? And so what does that lead to? It leads to complete inaction. And I think that people are afraid to get out there and put themselves out there from this, especially from this business social media, because it's not only a reflection on your company, and maybe you get in trouble with your boss, and your boss comes in and is like, why did you post that? And that probably won't happen, but there's these fears that we make up in our head to, hey, do my colleagues or peers out there think that what I'm posting is silly or wrong? So I guess leading into my next question are, Tristan, I'm curious, what are some ways to curb that fear? What are ways that people can get started with building out social posts from a company's podcast?
Yeah, so we'll go through some ideas here that I actually put these in a LinkedIn post not too long ago. So that's why we wanted to jump in and talk through these. And I think if you're able to provide your employees as an example or as a framework, it will help prevent that inaction that you're talking about, really, because I feel like a lot of employees are just frozen. They don't really know what to do. They don't have anything to start from. They're literally looking at a blank page. Or if you're in LinkedIn, it's like the post window. There's nothing there. It's blank. It's like, where do I start? How do I build a post around some content that my company's creating? How do I tie this to my customers and make it relevant to them? So people are frozen. So let's talk through some of the examples. And before I go down each one of these, I think there's a big idea here that's important to get across. The easiest way to describe how to get started with sharing podcast episodes and the content within the episodes is to share what you learn. So if you encourage your employees, and hopefully naturally they listen to your podcast anyway, if you just encourage them to share what they learn from the episodes in the form of social posts, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter, that's a good way to at least get the ball rolling. So let's just jump through some of the scenarios that I shared on LinkedIn not too long ago. One of the first things I think that is helpful that can create a post on LinkedIn is if you're able to share the summary of a podcast episode or the podcast outline even before you bring on the guest. So let's say you have some insight, if you're the host or you're the producer or you're maybe the executive that knows what's happening with the podcast. If you know you're having a guest on your show and you've prepared as a team, why don't you share some of those insights, like what you're trying to get out of the interview beforehand? And if you assemble a post out of those ideas, you can even create engagement by asking your audience what other questions they would like to ask your guests. So this is almost a precursor before you actually record the episode itself, and you're creating this sense of community with the folks that are either in your LinkedIn network or Twitter or what have you, and they're almost becoming a part of your show. And we do that every once in a while. We'll ask our customers, hey, we're having this guest on recorded content. Is there anything that you can think of that you would like us to ask them? So it's almost an inside track there. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, what do you think about that, Justin, as far as creating a post before you even have the podcast episode recorded?
I did it this morning. I wrote a post on a podcast episode that we recorded around script and building script. So, Tristan and I usually try to bundle these episodes together where we talk about a few different topics. So the one that we did before this is the ways to build a framework around a script. And so what did I do this morning? I wrote about why it's important to have a framework for a script. So I implement, and here we are. So, for me, I was preparing for the episode where, I was we kind of alternate, just to give you all a peek behind the curtain. Tristan and I alternate who kind of hosts these episodes between the two of us. So I'm hosting this one, and the previous one he hosted. So I was more of the subject matter expert in that episode, even though we both try to provide insights. And so as I was thinking about what it is that I was going to be talking about, I found it helpful to myself to put that into writing and to kind of take a stance and really build out what my methodology was going to be, what my thought process was going to be. And then when we came into the episode and Tristan went and asked me the questions that, I generally I knew were coming, I had already built out, a 300-word post on how I felt about it. And that also allowed me to have content this morning when I sat down at my computer. So I embody that that bullet point there, Tristan.
Yeah. All right. So if we have that example in place, so you're almost writing posts before you even record. So that's one example. Another thing is after the episode is live, and if you as an employee listen to the podcast, the other sample post that you can create is simply providing a summary on the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway that you had from the episode. So if you think about a 30 to 45 minute podcast episode for your company that was released, within that 45 minutes, there's probably one big thing that you were able to take away as a listener. And that might be different from someone else, but if you can write that up, put that into a LinkedIn post, and then perhaps couple that with an asset like a video or an image to reinforce the big takeaway that you had, that is a really good way to share a podcast episode that is way beyond just sharing a link to the episode itself. And I know you do that a lot, Justin, but like what's your approach for some of the recorded content stuff that we do?
Well, I'm gonna just keep living in the moment here. So in your previous bullet point, you mentioned as an employee hearing your own podcast that you're not necessarily the host of, and then posting what you learned from it. So what I'm going to do, that was my biggest surprise of this episode. I hadn't really thought about it that way. So when Tristan hosts an episode of recorded content, and I go to LinkedIn to then post about that episode, I almost write it as if I was also the host. And I'm like, hey, like, here's what Tristan talked about, but like, here's what you should learn from it. I'm actually going to start writing posts. This is my biggest surprise from this episode. I'm going to write a post about, what I've learned from Tristan's episode. And the one that immediately comes to mind, Tristan, is the ABT episode that you did with Park Howell. I think I messaged you afterward and I said, wow, I learned a lot from listening to our podcast. I wasn't the host on that episode. I didn't sit in on it. I don't sit in as a producer. So I heard it the same way that everybody else hears it. I put it on my podcast app while I was mowing the lawn. And I listened to Tristan talk to Park. And then when I go to write about it, I realize that I'm writing more from Tristan's perspective than maybe my perspective. So my biggest surprise from this episode is going to be, writing about our internal podcast as a listener and as someone who's taking things away just like you may be. So I think the best way that I can give an example or give my feedback is that, that's something that I'm going to do.
Yeah, and I think and you mentioned the biggest surprise, and I think those are almost like two different things where there's like a big takeaway that you can have. And then there's this, what you're talking about is a big surprise. Those are almost two separate posts that you can create, because I even view like a big surprise is something that maybe changed your mind, or, you kind of went into the episode expecting one thing, and the guest or the host or some interaction during the conversation changed your mind or brought something new to the surface. And those are very unique things that you can share in the form of a LinkedIn post or any other social format.
Which is what the big surprise is for me, is the idea. I had never thought about, heading into this episode, I had never thought about writing about our show as someone, because I don't host every single episode, and writing about our show as someone who is taking something away just like an audience member would. That was a surprise for me. It's something that gave me a new idea or a new way of thinking. And so, I think that's something that is worth writing about in and of itself, but then also something that I'm going to bring into my approach moving forward, which is, what you hope to get out of a podcast.
Yeah. And I know you're pulling in like real-time examples almost. The next idea is actually an example I used this morning on LinkedIn, which is using a quote from a podcast episode within your LinkedIn post. And we hear a lot where, as a copywriter or a marketer, you want to try and use the language that your customers use, and so that you can appear to be on the same page as folks. And I think a podcast episode is a great opportunity to do that. A lot of branded podcasts, they're bringing on industry influencers, prospects, customers, and these people are using language that you can then use in your own content. So you can literally take a quote, and that might be something that you learned, or that might just be a perspective on the industry. So, John, Sally said XYZ, and then you can provide your own perspective on that outlook. And that's what I did this morning. There was a guest that we had on recorded content that provided a viewpoint on how to use a podcast to bring in different perspectives from across your organization, and how to use a podcast to break down silos. And I actually used the quote from the episode to reinforce the idea that I had in the post. So that's just a way to really use the actual podcast content itself in the form of a social post.
Yeah, and for me, the greatest one ever was we did an episode around niche, or niche, however you say it. And Chris Lockhead said, "I'd rather matter to 1,000 people than be irrelevant to 100 million people." So they won't always be that great, but when you get them, use them. That quote we use, I think, all over the place in our marketing materials, not just on LinkedIn. But man, it's a heck of a quote to put at the top of a LinkedIn post.
That's right. So we have these quotes you can pull out. Another example is use the summary in your actual RSS feed. So when you do publish a podcast episode on whatever host that you're using, that populates your RSS feed, which then gets sent out to Apple, Spotify, etc. So there's a summary there that's included with every episode that you release. And if you're an employee, you can take that episode and use that as a foundation for a post, because ideally it provides a very good summary of what was included within the episode itself. And you can perhaps talk about some of the big ideas that were discussed. You have some information on the guest or the topic of the episode. So you almost have like this blueprint to work from, and it prevents you from having to start with the blank sheet of paper. The last one that I have here is perhaps one that will even make your posts more unique, and that's adding a personal story. So let's say you pull out a trend that was discussed in a podcast episode, or perhaps you use a quote from the guest or the host during a podcast episode. What you can do is then add a layer of your own experiences to that. So let's just think about this for a second. And I think this is a big opportunity for companies is, let's say you take like the same summary that each person has for the podcast episode. And if you have 10 employees that add their own unique story to that podcast summary, and they're providing their own layer of experiences to reinforce this idea, you have 10 completely unique posts that are now getting shared on LinkedIn or Twitter or anywhere else where your employees are having conversations online. So you're exponentially increasing not only the podcast episode content, but also the value that's contained within your organization. And I think that's something that people forget, that sometimes they'll just reiterate what's in a podcast episode and they'll forget, hey, I have valuable experiences that I can pull in as well to just add more color to what's already there. But what do you think about that, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, people are living and breathing what their company does every single day. And I think that a lot of folks discount what their voice means, question whether or not their opinions or views are valid. And I think that fortunately or unfortunately, it stems from leadership empowering people. And so my biggest recommendation would be, if there are any executives listening to this show, it's to empower your people to feel empowered. But encourage your team to go out there and post and have a voice, and recognize that, they're likely just as much of experts or more than a lot of the people reading their content. And then, as you mentioned, the more people you can have out there posting organically, you're just significantly increasing the firepower of your brand. And it's free advertising.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I'll just leave people with this. If you can pinpoint things that are interesting to you within a podcast episode and talk about that and write about that, chances are highly likely that your audience will find those things interesting too.
Absolutely. And I think that is a good place for us to stop. Hopefully, with some of the tips we covered, you'll be able to write more social posts from podcast episodes and encourage other employees, hopefully, to jump on board as well. That's all we have for this week's episode of Recorded Content. For Tristan and me, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.